I guess we'll get started because everyone's here and we really appreciate you coming. So my name's Jeff Bagg, the city planner, and I'm here with Jamie Webb, as the assistant planner, and Ted Harvey is a senior planner for the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission. So I just wanted to say something really quick, and then Jamie's going to give an overview of what we hope to do tonight. But I just want to thank everyone for coming. This is important. This is a tool and a strategy that the city has to identify sort of current and future projects that we want to prioritize to seek funding for. So one of the main things we'll talk about tonight is Community Development Block Grant, which is a fairly specific program. But as you'll see in the handout, the list has a lot of projects. There's 37 on there, not all of which can be funded by Community Development Block Grant funds. But it's one of our tools that we have that I guess the primary goal is that they all support one another. So we have an open space and recreation plan, which sets out very specific goals for our conservation land, priority open space. So the community development strategy may include some of those, but we definitely want to look to the open space plan for certain types of specific projects related to open space. And then the other really important document for us in the city is the master plan. So the 2008 master plan is unbelievably comprehensive, and the city passed, maybe some of the people in the room, but certainly many other people have contributed to making this document actually achievable, and a lot of the goals that are listed in the master plan have been achieved. A lot of the success that we have currently is really based upon the goals and strategies in the master plan. So this is a really great document that some of the goals and priorities that we'll talk about tonight are listed in here. Some are in the open space plan, but some are going to be unique to our list for the community development strategy. So Jamie's going to give an overview of what we're going to try to do to go over the list and update it. Ted is here for additional advice and assistance for the city looking at the next round of community development block grant funds. So there's an application that there's an opportunity for an application in the next couple months. So Pioneer Valley Planning Commission is assisting the city with that. So there is a sign-in sheet that we would love for you to sign in. That'd be great. And there is a couple more handouts which have the full list. So make sure you have a handout and sign in. So I think with that, I'll hand it over to Jamie to give us an overview.
Thank you. So just to give a brief overview of what we're doing, we're really here to have a discussion about the community development planning, the strategies and the projects, as Jeff just mentioned. And the discussion we want to have tonight focuses on identifying the city's community development needs, establishing a priority list. We can see that in the handout, and reorganizing that if it doesn't make sense based off today's environment, and to discuss a little bit about current and future block grant projects. There'll be another meeting January 30th, where we will actually take all the information that we gathered today, and we're going to put the DHCD, Department of Housing and Community Development, a project or a couple of projects based off of the strategy list that based off the input that we've gotten today. So that meeting is going to be January 30th. It'll be in this room. If people want to come to that meeting, there'll be more specific information as to what we're planning for in that FY19 plan. As part of that application, we have to show that we've had a community involved planning initiative. And so this is something that we've been doing every year for the last 20 years. We periodically review the strategy, and it's a required part of that application, but it's also been very instrumental in applying for and getting other grants in the city. The MassWorks grants that we've received, parks, which is parkland acquisitions and renovations for communities, the drinking water supply protection grants. There's been a lot of grants over the years, but we've used this strategy list to show, and this planning process to show community involvement, and it's really, it makes our applications stand out, which is why we're getting so this discussion today is really be the basis of that update for the community involvement planning. After the meeting tonight, we're going to review it based on, we're going to update it based on comments and information received tonight. It'll be posted on the city's website on the planning department page for further review and comment. Then it'll be submitted as part of that application. So before I go any further, I just want to make sure that everyone's signed in. And if there are still some extra copies of the handout, we do use that sign-in sheet to show that we actually had a legitimate planning process and it wasn't just free planners in the room.
Can I just jump in on
Yeah.
so, and I think you may get to this, I think one of the, there's sort of two really primary activities that we're hoping to do tonight. One is to go through this list of projects and try to make sure that if you have any new projects that aren't listed. So that is an important part of our process is for you to look at the list and think, what about that or this other project? It may not be able to get funded by community development block grant funds, but this is a good opportunity to add to the list. So that's kind of one of our goals. And then the other goal, after we've gone through it and added potentially new items, is then try to take a look at the prioritization of them and just see if this small group wants to sort of emphasize other projects moving in the priority list. So those are kind of like two overarching things that we hope to accomplish in the next hour or so. New items, and then if there's consensus amongst this group about bumping items up or moving around a little bit, then that's definitely something we want to try to do.
So the strategy this year, most of the projects fall into one of four categories. It's either housing, public infrastructure, downtown and economic development, and social services. And those also have the pots, the pots that the CDBG can fund. So while we're talking about this, sort of keep those in mind. Where a proposed project might in one of those four areas.
Excuse me, Jamie, could you just repeat those categories?
Housing, public infrastructure, downtown and economic development, and social services. So it looks like everyone has the list, and what we would like to do to get more involvement is to go round robin style. We're just going to take turns reading the goals and the objectives, and then the priority list. If you don't feel comfortable reading out loud, just say skip me, then we'll go to the next person.
Okay, pop quiz. What were the other two? So we have housing,
Infrastructure.
and
social services.
Thank you.
For those of you who just came in, can you please make sure to sign in to there's a sign-in sheet that's going around. Thank you. Someone like to start off reading goals and objectives. Number one.
Strengthen downtown through increased housing units, continued affordability of commercial space, access to gathering space, and links to public transportation. Expand the downtown to include Pleasant Street route infrastructure, signage, and aesthetic improvements.
Thank you. Yeah, but we'll start with the projects and then we'll go to the goals.
Yes, I think that's good.
Can I just ask a question before I read?
Yeah.
How much money are we talking about usually from a CDBG grant that the city gets? And two, once we go through this process, who makes the final decision on what's going to happen?
For the funding piece of it, it's over, the most you can have in 1 year is 800,000. That's the max. And over a 2-year period, it's 1.3.
And how have we been doing in the past? Have we even approached that, or is it more around 200?
In 2018, we received the maximum grant allowed, 800,000.
Oh, great.
In 2016, we received the maximum grant allowed, 800,000. In 2016.
So with that, there's real money there.
Yeah, I mean, over the last 20 years, I think we've received about $11 million in CDBG funding.
And the second question, who makes the final decision?
The mayor makes we'll put together the application with the help of our consultant, Feather Valley Planning Commission. The application comes from, it's signed off by the mayor, so if it doesn't get her approval, it doesn't go to the state.
Number two, continue the housing rehabilitation program throughout the city with grant funds supplemented by community preservation funds, program income.
We can kind of, intersperse kind of reading one with some questions. I think, again, just keep in mind, we're going through the list, so you can oriented to the list and then think of projects that might not be on the list as well.
Just to follow up or clarify Mike's question, we don't receive a pot of money and then decide where to spend it. It's tied to a specific project that's submitted, and that money's awarded to fund that.
Right. And it's something that we can probably lead through the discussion tonight, but it's fairly complex to first identify the type of criteria that have to be met, and then there's a timeline associated with making the application. So I think maybe interspersed through the discussion, we'll kind of unravel that a little bit.
So we could have something be prioritized number 12, but the fact that we could make it funded before 5 because of the grant cycle.
Yes, I think the grant cycle and there's other criteria.
Yeah, I'm
that
just using it as I don't even look, picking numbers out.
Well, in the last few years, we've been doing a lot of public infrastructure improvements, and those projects take up a lot of the grant money. So often we'll get one item off, do one item and maybe some housing rehab or something. So it'll take a lot to get to 37, at least with the block grant funding.
Extra copies of
And Jamie, in addition, other outside organizations
Share now.
also can petition the city to put proposals for
Necessary at the moment.
CPD funding.
We could get 20 more people.
Yes, so as part of that application, the city chooses what to apply for, and if there are, let's say, a social service agency that comes to the city and wants funding, if we made that part of our application, then once we receive funding, we'd have to go out to bid for that social service. So it's not a direct link for an agency to get the money directly.
It's not a one, I understand. But that still exists. We used to do that at the Valley's Agency for an application and a proposal for a program, it would be the yay or nay.
Yeah.
So that still goes in addition to what we're doing here.
Exactly, because in the past, Valley CDC's run first-time homebuyer classes for the city, housing foreclosure prevention classes.
Business TA.
Yeah, and so I believe that we would have to go out to bid once we got the funding.
Thank you.
So for those that arrive late, we're just kind of having people jump in and read the goals as we go, just to get oriented with something
You
like
need to make some more copies? Have a copy in the building?
Yeah, I have this one I can
Well, just, if anybody else comes, then
we'll save paper for now.
Just do it.
So,
Only made enough for 20.
anyone you want to read number 3? Anybody?
3, aggressively support the
Thank you.
redevelopment and reuse of vacant buildings to mix use in the mill industrial and downtown zoning districts. Assist with commercial and residential brownfield redevelopment. Continue support for redevelopment of 1 Ferry Street, Pleasant Street Mills, and 154 Everett Street.
Thank you.
What's 154 Everett Street? Is that our housing?
154 Everett Street.
That's the former gas station.
Yeah.
Oh, that's that,
No.
the building
Yeah.
that's kind of,
Yeah. So there has been fits and spurts at trying to make
Yeah.
something happen there. So, I mean, it's totally relevant that it's on the list and
Yeah.
up at the top.
Or develop and refurbish infrastructure to promote smart growth initiatives in neighborhoods.
5, build energy efficient, affordable housing through public-private partnerships.
6, construct new schools and complete improvements per state guidance and funding.
7, improve design and operation of Union and Northampton Street to allow all modal users to use them safely.
8, expand services and activities for youth and young adults, including diversity training and school tour programs, include youth in the creation of a youth center.
9, continue assistance such as planning, marketing, financing, and startup for businesses, micro enterprises, and artists, including maker collective workspaces.
10, marketing support Easthampton's Cottage Street Cultural District, support an increase in public art and art education.
11, maintain up-to-date technology in all schools and municipal facilities.
12, provide financial literacy and foreclosure prevention programs to increase financial stability. Offer first-time homebuyer resources such as counseling, down payment, closing cost assistance, and mortgage subsidies.
So before we go to 12, there's just something pretty remarkable about this list so far is to work backwards really quick. You know, the number of things that we have been looking at that are on this list. So Union Street is on a proposed plan to be reconstructed in 2021. The school, reconstruction project is here. The support of the Cottage Street Cultural District. There was one other that I just really wanted to mention, which Ferry Street. Yes, that's a big one. It was the I apologize because I lost it. The first-time homebuyer program, which is something that you don't often hear about, but it's something that we have been operating that out of the planning department for a couple of years. So there are a lot of things that, especially at the top of the list, that we've been focused on doing. So,
May I ask a question, please?
Sure.
My name is Winnie Dusham. I live on Federal Street, New City, and the pamphlet that we got in the mail showed pictures of street and redoing streets, water and sewer, sidewalks and things, and it listed a bunch of streets in New City. Why am I reading about Union Street and all these other streets and new schools and stuff like that? Am I in the wrong meeting, or did I get the wrong information?
No, that's a great question. So, just perusing the other list, there's probably something about updating infrastructure in other neighborhoods, but what we did with that, so this is where maybe Ted can jump in as well. We sent out information to the area around Parsons Street to determine income levels, to see if it would be an area that would qualify for community development block grant funding in the future. So we tried to start the process to see if that might be one of the projects we could move forward for FY19.
So are you saying that there's a possibility that on Ferry Street, the new complex that's going up, might get 100% of the financing, but us on Federal Street won't get new sidewalks?
No, I don't think that that's what, so the Ferry Street project includes some road improvement, and the idea of looking at Parsons Street would be to potentially look at the infrastructure on Parsons Street where it meets Ferry Street to connect on the other side. So Ferry Street's going to have infrastructure improvements, and the idea is that we should begin looking at this funding to see if we can upgrade the infrastructure on Parsons and Ferry to connect the two and have a unified, upgraded infrastructure in the area.
Which is great, and again, maybe I'm missing this, but we're also talking about Hoyle Street and Union Street and stuff like that in downtown. We're not in downtown, so.
Right, I mean, I think the idea of where we might be crossing paths is, this is probably one of those newer projects that we would want to see on the list with some input tonight. We sent out the flyers with a request that if anyone had questions or wanted information about the block grant program to come tonight. So I think throughout the rest of the discussion, let's keep an eye on that, because I think we're trying to help. There's a certain level of importance of filling out those surveys. So, Ted, do you want to talk about the technical way that applications get created?
Well, so this, what he's, sorry, what was his name?
Wayne.
Wayne. So what Wayne's referring to is, when we have these infrastructure projects, the state likes to see that we've kind of done our due diligence, and we have to show that it's an area that that meets the low income, moderate income qualifications. So that's what this process starts. And so the reason that, like Jeff was saying, the reason we're now focusing on that is on your neck of the woods, your neighborhood, is that kind of ties in with what has started over on Ferry Street. And so basically, it's not on this list yet because this is from last year, and that's why we're going over it. And so with the new, I wouldn't say new, but the continued emphasis on Ferry Street, we figured that this would be a good neighborhood. To your point, you know, we want new sidewalks and new infrastructure in there as well. That will kind of tie into Ferry. So that's kind of what's our initial thinking, and my guess is that will now be included on this list. This is just all this. That's where we're at.
Anybody remember what number we were on?
13.
We'll start over.
Anyone in the back row want to read a couple?
Okay. 13, increase senior citizen services to improve health and living conditions.
13, increase access to residents with disabilities through physical improvements and programs.
15, provide local services to disadvantaged populations, including persons with disabilities, including veterans, domestic violence residents, and residents under age 60, to assist with self-sufficiency, financial stability, inadequate housing, under health-related issues.
16, support job assistance and training for Easthampton's workforce and unemployed.
17, infrastructure improvements to Montauk Park and existing neighborhood parks such as Pleasant Street, Strong Street, Wayside Park, such as restrooms, parking areas. Do I have to read this whole thing? Are we in like elementary school?
Yes, we are.
I mean, we can all read. What are we doing? We're wasting time.
We're being a community.
Yeah, we're trying to just work
Okay.
through the list. Not everyone.
I have to say, if my son was here, he learns orally, he can't.
Okay, I'll keep going.
So-
Administration and maintenance buildings, indoor, outdoor pool repair and replacement, park furniture, youth play areas, and lighted ball field. Protect environmentally sensitive areas of the parks.
18, continue physical improvements to Old Town Hall, including elevator, fire escape, repaired stained glass windows, restoration of the auditorium, and repainting of the building.
19, continue phase development of Lower Miltown Park, including a new skate park. Consider other expanded events, including concerts, art shows, and festivals.
20, provide educational services for all sectors of the population, including adult-based education. Ensure residents are aware of available local resources.
21, continue preservation of priority agricultural lands, particularly along Park Hill and East Street. Work with the Agricultural Commission to promote local food and agricultural security, as well as requiring growing a significant portion of food for local use through leases and contracts for city-owned land under APR.
22, protect the Barnes aquifer through land acquisition in the southern end and regulatory protection in northern zone 2.
23, Easthampton Energy Commission to promote and act on energy self-sufficiency and increase conservation. Develop and implement new green energy sources and develop renewable energy sources for small businesses and homeowners, including EV charging stations.
24, continue to work on issues such as increased access to and use and improvement of pedestrian ways and public transit, including expanding coverage of PDPA.
25.
I was going to go actually.
25, develop an industrial retention expansion program, increase the supply of industrial zoned land through zoning review and site identification of appropriate industrial use locations, seek opportunity for development of small industrial park, attract computing center spinoffs.
26, increase local capacity by providing staff and or technical assistance for economic development, conservation, housing, and engineering infrastructure.
27, create and implement a list of uses for Community Preservation Act affordable housing funds according to the state law. In exchange for affordable housing restrictions, 15 to 30 years, funds could be used for buy down of housing prices, down payment assistance, rental assistance, pre-development funds, or construction match.
28, modify zoning with tools that establish incentives and requirements for affordable housing.
29, create links between surrounding neighborhoods to the Manhattan Rail Trail.
Can I pause here? So we're almost done with the task of going through the existing list, but again, it's just striking me that one of the things that maybe I would like to try to initiate is a checklist of how well we've met some of this stuff and the projects that have been attempted to meet these objectives. So just going backwards quick through the list, the Manhattan Rail Trail connection. So we have a project that's about to start with the Conway School to explore a connection or a way to connect from the rail trail to the new elementary school. And within that, I think we'll look at the basic connections off of the rail trail and start to identify those. The Community Preservation Act has been pretty active in supporting affordable housing development. So if you think of Parsons Village and 15 Cottage Street, CPA funds were involved in those projects. In terms of increasing local capacity, so last year the DPW hired a new staff engineer, and the conservation agent that we have in the planning department was funded first by a grant, and then we were able to fund that position part-time last year in the budget. So we're moving towards kind of some of those goals. Skipping a couple, but the Energy Commission, so we are a green community, and so we do have an Energy Commission who applies for funds, and there's another funding round coming up in the spring that could be used for certain things. We, the city, acquired a parcel on the border, crosses the border with Southampton to help protect Lawrence Aquifer, so that was 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. 21, if you didn't hear, we heard today that we were awarded the park grant, which was an application we had outstanding for $400,000 to help purchase, part of 20 acres on East Street. And then, Lower Mill Pond, the park has been really great and become much more active. So certainly I skipped a couple, but we have done a lot of things that are on this list. And so, I see a hand, and then we were on number 30.
So before you go further, recap what you've done, what we just read off. How are you coming along on the modifying or coming up with some strategies for improving the zoning bylaws? And because I know that's been it's been problematic in terms of some of the language in the zoning bylaw, and probably needs some updating some areas, like dealing with industrial land and that kind of stuff.
So there's certain things that we will do in-house with our planning department, which is, you're looking at me, Jamie, it's our planning department, really. There's little things we can do in-house, but we pretty much, our eyes are peeled for funding for that type of project. The funding for that type of project is not as readily available as some of the other projects that we just listed. So a zoning overhaul is expensive, and it's the kind of thing that doesn't yield immediate results, but it would make the process easier in the long term. So I think I have no exact status update for you, except that we're always on the lookout for funding for that kind of project. So it's on the list, and I think that's important for now.
Wait, I'm confused. Why would you need funding to change the zoning, right? That's just paper, right?
Well, you can do small incremental changes to your zoning over time. You run through a labyrinth of city council, ordinance subcommittee, planning board, full city council for adoption. So that in and of itself can take 3, 5, 6 months for simple changes. So we did that. So we amended the zoning for the poultry, the keeping of chickens. That took a fair amount of time, you wouldn't believe, for just allowing us more flexibility for people to keep chickens. I think,
Talk about recreational marijuana to how many months to
yeah,
get through.
so get the cannabis ordinance was challenging, but that was all done in-house. I think, to Mr. Cannon's point, what has been on the list for quite some time is an overhaul. So reworking the whole ordinance so that it's not a patchwork that's been created over the past 20 years and is more cohesive. It's a bigger undertaking, so it's probably a separate meeting in and of itself. But I don't want to belabor that too much.
And I don't want to belabor too much, but it is going to rear its ugly head, you know,
Fair enough.
at some point in time in here.
The good thing is it's on the list.
Yes.
So, all right, number 30. Anybody? We're almost done.
30, inventory city-owned properties and develop plan for reuse of vacant, underutilized properties. As land and school buildings are considered for disposal, affordable housing should be a priority reuse.
31, assist with improvements to Emily Williston Library, including building accessibility and community resources.
32, include affordable housing and open space preservation projects such as the construction of housing along East Street while preserving a large segment of open space.
Promote awareness and increase outreach and education about historic resources and districts. Create historic districts for listing on the National Register, including the Mill District, Main/Park Street, and Union/Cottage Streets.
Encourage new downtown and mill industrial development to match the historic character of the community.
Improve public safety through services that link with health programs, homeland security, emergency preparedness, and healthy community initiatives.
36, update the transfer of development rights, TDR ordinance to create more incentives for use. Move TDR to housing developers.
37, improve access to Manhattan River, including a waterway for non-motorized boats.
Great.
Thank you. So, have all of those projects fit into the, on the first page of that handout, the goals and objectives. So, we just take one more minute to read through those goals and objectives. We can start taking the discussions about where we think we're missing activities or goals, objectives, and where they should fit into the list. So I'll start with number 1, goals and objectives. Create and retain housing available to residents with a broad range of incomes. The increase in maintenance of the supply of both rental and ownership units are necessary.
I'll do number 2. So to enhance the local climate for sustainable economic development in the commercial downtown, the industrial and manufacturing base, green energy, and the growing arts cluster.
All right, the open space and recreation priorities focus on the preservation of land over the Barnes Aquifer, along Mount Tom, along the Manhattan River Greenway, and land for agricultural use. Recreation improvements are focused on existing parks and access to local ponds.
I love it, the competition.
For bring public services and technological resources to and expand those currently in the city that complement population needs and community development priorities.
Protect key historic and cultural resources through the reuse of Old Town Hall and the recognition and protection of key historic districts and sites, including but not limited to the Emily Wilson Library, Maple School, and Center School, will contribute to the long-term maintenance of Easthampton's community character.
Create growth through planning growth, activities-based, and links between people, infrastructure, resources, and services.
So perhaps I think now we want to transition, I think, to maybe what you want to do is fire off slowly so I can take some notes, projects or items that are not on the list. So I'm going to stand up in a moment to flip this over.
Again, living on Federal Street, bordering the land of the old school that was purchased.
Carson Street.
Carson Street. Behind that, there's a parcel of land that still belongs to the town that's being used for a dump-off service for snow and other things that's not being maintained. What are we gonna do with that parcel of land? Can that be used for open space or some child playgrounds?
Great. So I think we'll try to keep going and gather some, and then we'll talk about kind of prioritizing stuff.
And I thought that's what it was slated for way back when they dispensed with the building and they parceled off that back, that would be used in the future as some kind of open space or playground area, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the general idea.
Yeah.
For that parcel.
Dog
Yeah.
parks on that list for that space.
Yeah, so just real quick, one of the things that the City Council Property Subcommittee is beginning to look at is the possibility for the city to have a dog park somewhere. So there's a series of discussions that are probably going to start with the subcommittee tomorrow, and then branch out into a broader discussion about possible locations for such a thing. And because that's a city-owned property, it happens to be on the list amongst many other sort of possible uses.
How big
for
is that space?
That parcel is about an acre. So the city is, there are grant funding opportunities for dog parks. Several communities have pursued that, South Hadley, Agawam, and a couple others. So we're going to look at initiating that process, which would involve public meetings and public discussion about a chosen site. Okay, so that's on the list. Or it will go, that's going on this sheet to be determined.
Yeah.
Bill.
The goal number 5, which touches upon something that is probably going to come up in the future, and that's the reuse of Pepin Center School, Maple Street School. Once the new school comes online, it's going to supposedly consolidate all those grades that are currently in those buildings. Is there anything that we're thinking about in terms of guidelines or anything else that can be put together for, and it may be premature for that until we get going on the school.
Well, I think,
but it's something that we probably should be thinking about, how that's going to be used and how it's going to be integrated into the downtown, central business district.
yes, so that was a top priority leading up to the vote in May. And so it seems like you may not be aware unless you're asking the question, so I talk about it, but we got funding from the state from a planning assistance grant to look at the possible reuse of the 2 schools. So it's $50,000 plus a match locally of $15,000. So we have a $65,000 funding source. We sent out a request for proposals. This was all kind of covered by Gazette and Mass Live, but so we have responses and they're under review. So that is a project that you would expect to surface late winter or early spring. So it's been dubbed like a downtown strategic plan. So the concept is to look at Cottage Street and Union Street sort of collectively around the possible reuse of the 2 schools. So where we seem to have 3 or 4 years, now is the time to start exploring those. So the vision for this grant is to take the first step, to have some public meetings, to talk to people, to draw, people can draw on plans and talk about what they think should happen at the school property. So that's certainly underway. That's something that is a project that we have secured funding for.
Is there a priority for those schools, or is it just for the town to unload them and get them off the tax bracket?
Get them on it.
Well, my example is again, I'm going to say this again, being on a butter to Parsons Street, that was sold for a steal.
Yeah.
Was it a matter of that we just wanted to unload it and get a little bit of tax money, or do we want to do something that's productive for the community?
Wayne, just to clarify, Parsons Street School was sealed bids, and the person who, quote unquote, got it for a song was the only bidder.
Okay.
So you and I could have bid on it and bid more.
I wish I had known.
It was a sole bidder.
Okay.
We believe that there's an opportunity with the amount of time that we have to come up with a clearer vision for the reuse of those schools. And at the end of that, when they are ready to be taken off of the city, to be disposed of, I guess the proper term, that we'll have a plan for a proposal that we seek for those.
I agree with what Tom said. Don't get me wrong. It's like, I understand that was a sealed bid. You're correct.
So the rub will come, and Mike Gar's going to do this one. I noticed Jeff has this listed under historic, but, so it's going to be a question of, do you save the building or don't you? And you've got some prime examples. So that property would have sold for much closer to $1 million if there wasn't a restriction to keep the school.
Okay.
So the buyer has to keep the school, buys it for $10,000, and puts $2 million in it to make apartments. He could have removed the building. I'm not here to say that's good or bad. He could have removed the building and put up multi-family housing in there. It would have netted the city a lot more money. So what's going to happen with Maple? What kind of restrictions are going to go on it? Center, and I know it's not in that district, but don't forget Pepin School is part of this too.
Right.
Maple,
Yes.
Memorial Hall is an example. So Memorial Hall was sold with restrictions. We have what you have there today. In our beautiful downtown, we have Memorial Hall. Say what you want about Memorial Hall, but that's what we have there today. Because the restriction was when it was sold, the building had to stay. For historic reasons. If I showed you a picture of what Easthampton High School looked like when it was there, it looks nothing like the building is today. So that's where the rub's going to come with this committee down the road is, do you keep the buildings, don't you keep the buildings, what are the pros and cons? What's the real benefit to the city with the building there or with the building gone?
I understand totally, but my issue is that, and I'm a transplant to this town. I've been here for 30 years, okay? I'm a Hilltown person. I don't think that I was informed in the past of what was going on to these buildings. All of a sudden, I just read that it's going out for bid, silent bid, and it was purchased for $10,000. I want to be more involved in what happens to these schools.
Yeah, well, I think it's good, and I think we're close to debating what to do with schools, but it's on the list, and I think, I don't want to cut off the conversation, but I want to make sure that we hear other new ideas, because this is on the list. I think the purpose of the meeting tonight is that this should go on the list. So, because we have $50,000 worth of planning money, it's not a lot. So it's the first step of probably a multi-year process to figure out how the schools will end up in 4 or 5 years. But so I'd say stay tuned, because we have something we're working on something for that.
And actually, to tie into being informed, in terms of maintaining up-to-date technology for municipal facilities, and I think this would fall under the infrastructure bucket. I've talked to the mayor a little bit in the past about trying to find a way to keep citizens informed. So we all know that many events like this one was put onto Facebook, which I'm largely ignoring right now. I just happen to bounce on for a hot minute and see it. We have a phone system in place for emergency alerts. So we have a phone system that you can sign up to with a landline or a cell phone and get alerted when there's going to be road closures, when there's going to be infrastructure work and street closures, when a mountain is closed. What I've spoken about before, and what might fall into this bucket, is having some similar system for community meetings or city meetings that require community involvement. I'm glad that you got the pamphlet and to find out about this meeting, but there's got to be a way to reach more of the community, to have more of the community involved.
I think that's good. I think that captures that. That's good.
Jeff, knowing that we have no idea where the money might come from for some of these projects, I think with the proposed development this year on Northampton Street and prospective future development, I think one of the longer term goals has to be look at the possibility of widening Northampton Street.
And what was the Northampton Street item that was on the list?
7.
7. Right. So we're kind of close with number 7, but maybe there's some additional text that can be added in there to kind of clarify. So that's all modes of transportation. So
there might be Northampton Street's a state highway. I don't know. The Union Street is.
141
is a state highway.
Well, but you can even maybe relook at how things flow.
So we'll add some bulk in there, but I think the idea is to begin to look at possible traffic mitigation measures for Northampton Street as well as the entire stretch.
Just Northampton Street, Cottage Street, and Holyoke Street.
Well, I think, I would suspect that that may come up, so
Yeah.
if you want to, I think we should carve them off, maybe, not by every street, we don't have time to do every street, but there are a couple important ones. I've lost track of who had their hand up first.
Okay, so I just wanted like number 7, if we could narrow it down as far as crosswalk safety. And they're so dark in so many places, and this kind of grant may be perfect for allowing some kind of lighting for the crosswalks. We might see a lot of that very long crosswalk right across from the center.
Yeah, it's very dark.
Maybe consider removing some of the crosswalks.
Right, and so Union Street, just to be clear, there is an entire project devoted to Union Street. It's 2021 is the projected construction date. We do have plans online. The preliminary plans are on the planning department page, and the projected schedule is that in February or March, Mass DOT, who basically is going to fund the project, will be holding a series of public meetings in Easthampton about the preliminary design. So that's something we're just, we have the funding secured, so it's a $2.5 million reconstruction project, and we're marching towards the process to move that into like prime time, I guess I would say very casually. But so that is something, the plans are available, and it's a full reconstruction to bring Union Street into complete streets compliance. So it's looking at the lane width, trying to incorporate bikes and then pedestrian crosswalks. So I think to your point, there are way too many crosswalks on Union Street, and the city has done work on this. So in 2015 maybe, the Cecil group, so we had a study done on Union Street which kind of identified that as like a key issue. So Union Street is on the list already. There are plans in place. So maybe number 7 can be broken out to identify Union Street, but also kind of re-clarify a look at Northampton Street more specifically. Sorry, I think Tom and then the gentleman in the back.
This is sort of bouncing off what Joe just said, but I kind of would like to see something on there. There's a few things that touch on this, but I'd like to see something on there explicitly addressing pedestrian safety across the entire downtown district.
Maybe not just pedestrian safety, but pedestrian access. You know, making it more easy for pedestrians to get along the streets from one to another. Yeah, that's true.
And I guess, Jeff, I understand 21 for Union Street, but, you know, is there a way to do something in advance? Union Street's a great example. At 7-Eleven, there's a crosswalk. We've got the bike path crosswalk, and there's a crosswalk right in front of the old fire station. You barely step on the gas and you're at another crosswalk and you're at another crosswalk. When you go up a little bit further, there's one by the barber shop, and then there's another one right in front of Peter Rapid, and then there's another one up a little bit further. So, you know, give me a can of black paint and we can get rid of a few crosswalks.
So I would kind of, short term potential fixes to Union Street.
To the number of crosswalks.
Right. I would encourage people to find the Union Street study that was done in 2015, because I remember just being a resident in Easthampton, I wrote a letter for that one saying that the number of crosswalks on Union Street is too many, unsafe. So temporary, short-term fixes.
Yeah, and I think to Tom's point, if we narrow it down to where there might only be 2 major crosswalks on Union Street, then maybe those can be illuminated and brought up, and so people know this is where I should be crossing, and the cars know this is where I might see a pedestrian, because there's not 6 crosswalks on Union Street, but maybe only 2.
But why is having too many crosswalks a problem?
The cars get frustrated and then go fast.
Yes.
You barely stop and you go in.
Right, and I would jump in just because it's not necessarily that there are too many, but what it is the mid blocks where there's no corresponding intersection where cars are moving or traveling. So it's in the middle of you're just driving and there's all of a sudden a crosswalk. So the one like where the Button building is, where our favorite Hurry Scurry building is, there's a crosswalk right there, just seemingly in the middle of the block. So those are called mid-blocks, and those are like the most challenging ones.
Well, yeah, that's a good example right by 7-Eleven.
Right by 7, yeah.
You go to 7-Eleven, you take a right there, and immediately as you turn right, you gotta stop because there's a crosswalk.
Yeah.
Well, look, I don't pretend to know what the exact correct way to handle these traffic safety issues are, but I do definitely think that if we're talking about ways we could spend a big pot of money we potentially get, that for me, pedestrian access, pedestrian safety in the downtown, the whole downtown business district, not just Union Street.
Right.
Cottage Street obviously is a priority for me because that's my precinct.
Yep.
But that to me is really, really high on that list.
Sure, and I don't want to be the only one talking, but I think that there are so many things that are interacting with this list, which is, so if you're not aware, the city does have complete streets funds to address some of the crosswalk issues on Cottage Street. So there are different pots of money for different types of activities. So if we're shifting a little bit from community development block grant, we would be looking at those kinds of things from different pots of money, and that's how we do let's kind of look at this list and look for the funding source that would potentially fund the project. Jamie, looks like you're going to add something.
Yeah, I just wanted to, with the CDBG funding, it's complicated in downtown because the money comes from the state, which comes from the federal government, and the federal government requires that there are these large national objectives where it has to benefit primarily low and moderate income individuals and families, and it has to be primarily residential neighborhoods. In the downtown area, they have a one section, the national objective is through slum and blight designation, which no one wants to really do because it's not a very nice name. But back in 2000, the slum and blight designation was used to redo Upper Cottage Street, as well as the sidewalks and lighting on Pleasant Street. And so that, there are ways to make the most easy application or way forward with the CDBG fund.
Should we just be
Sorry, no, you asked the question, yeah.
Yeah, so should we just be focusing on projects that are, because I noticed there are a number of things on this prioritization of projects that that say just Mass Highway or city or private foundation that are not CDBG eligible. Should we just be focusing for this exercise on projects that are CDBG eligible?
No.
Okay.
Sorry,
so thinking about this in general, we can either spend the money, you buy a parking lot, you spend $100 grand on it, there goes $100 grand, and you're going to drive cars on it instead, that's it. Or you can invest the money and create perpetual streams of income into the city so that the dollars that we get on this will continue to perpetuate income to the city. And to me, if we can leverage this money and take $800,000 and turn it into $100 grand a year of perpetual income, then it's better than spending money on a parking lot. So you can go through money very fast building a building. But if you leverage it and fund, let's say, I'll use my own experience, the Valley CDC, affordable housing, well, now you fund a program that then goes out and raises millions of dollars to produce affordable housing, rather than spending millions of dollars to build the house yourself. So I would think that we want to look at whether we're investing the money or spending the money. You could put $10,000 into loan guarantees for small business, probably guarantee $100,000 worth of loans with it, maybe, Tom, and help 4 small businesses start businesses in town. And so it's not a lot of money to spend or invest to keep a perpetual income. So I think anything that is leveraging would be something that we ought to be focusing on.
Okay. Yep.
So we're proposing things that are at odds with each other. So some people are saying we need to widen the roads, make room for more cars, we need to restrict pedestrian movements even more than they're already restricted. And then at the same time we're saying we want more safety and more access for pedestrians. So that doesn't make any sense to me. Not only that, but I mean, I feel like the narrow streets are one of the things that I love about this town. and you know, like widening streets seems really a degradation of what makes, you know, one of the things that is great about it.
Well, I know Eli in particular, you have a lot more intimate knowledge on some of the sort of elements of something like complete streets and how that does compete potentially with, so whether you're choosing to move cars or helping people get around. So there is an inherent conflict, and that's not something I would be trying to avoid or ignore. I think, but for the purposes of this, I think we're close to coming up with maybe like a generalized goal, which is more around pedestrian safety on key streets or something along that lines as a general goal, and then there's going to be specific priority items within that. So then there's sort of more specific things like temporary fixes on Union Street. I'm not trying to ignore what you are suggesting. It is sort of a reality that this is not the exercise to balance all those out. It'll be more, if we start looking at Union Street in more detail, that project you balance out whether it's more beneficial to widen the road for cars, create bike lanes, or enhance pedestrian safety, or if there's a way to do all three.
Jeff, I think one of the slight differences there might be a highway versus downtown. So if we were going from the Rotary to Nene's, that business district, you definitely want to slow traffic down and make it very pedestrian friendly. If I look at Northampton Street, I look at that a little bit more as highway, and I'm not so sure there's even a crosswalk on Northampton Street other than at the lights potentially. So think of it as Route 9 in Hadley versus if there is downtown Hadley. You know, a little busier, more businesses. I guess that was the difference I was thinking of, the highway versus, definitely we're not looking at widening any streets downtown. Pretty much can't do it.
The contractor, who's a long-time local here that seems to have had a lot of inside information, he was telling me, and I don't see this as part of this, what you're talking about here, that Cottage Street was going to be made into a one-way street and have more walking availability on it, and that the opposite direction was going to go through Maple Street and have some buildings taken down and connect somehow to Liberty Street by cutting through. Is that something that was?
I mean, I don't think it's necessarily insider information. It's a historic thought for Cottage Street. So it goes back to what Jamie was referring to. The 2000 between 2000 and 2002 was a larger project, a visioning project about Cottage Street.
So
and
it's still a
I've seen the sketch. And then the block grant funds were used to make certain upgrades, and then some of that made it to reality and some of it didn't. I would suspect that when we start talking about Maple Street School, that notion comes back and needs to be revisited. I don't think it's something that's like currently proposed or considered, but I think it's a reality of when you start looking at Cottage Street, what are the options? What are the biggest, most general options for Cottage Street? And then start to test them on reality, like based on reality, what could actually happen. So I don't know if I answered it enough, but it's a historic vision.
And
yeah,
it really isn't.
I have been meaning to kind of find those files, but we can do that and maybe post the sort of historic visioning exercises that were done in 2000. And saying historic, it wasn't that long ago, but anyway, it's not a current discussion as far as.
But it has been a constant, ongoing discussion during master planning, processes in here about the street system and the traffic flow in the downtown area.
And I think, Bill,
oh yeah, it's been talked about a lot.
Right, so I guess it's not new, as I think. Right, well. Yeah.
And I think what you run up against, Bill, is that historically the businesses don't like one-way traffic. And when we simply say send it down Maple Street, talk to the residents on Maple Street and see how they feel about it. So you end up with that.
I understood some of those buildings were going down, so they wouldn't be.
Well, they're all privately owned, so they can't go down unless the city wants to.
Well,
unless Jeff's got a pot of gold. One other piece on infrastructure, Jeff, that was back of the napkin years ago was we do have specifically, and on the air on the out, that we do have two fairly dangerous intersections on Cottage Street. Intersections where cars roll through. So if you're coming off of Chapel Street, you roll right into an intersection of 5 streets. Okay? If you're coming off of Adams/Maple, you roll right into Cottage Street. And it was a redesign of that done years ago on the back of a napkin that had those that you came to a 90-degree angle and had to stop and take a left or a right on both ends of that block. So in front of Brass Cat, it forced you into a 90-degree turn instead of that rolling street. And on the other end, by the variety store, it forced you into a 90-degree turn in front of Nini's. It eliminated that end of Chapel Street so that you definitely have to come to a stop and take a left or a right. Same discussion we're having up on Park Street about South Street, stopping those rolling intersections.
I think it makes sense to be kind of specific and have it on the list, whether it's block grant again or whether that's a complete street. So complete streets, the funding opportunities come up every year. I just want to be clear that there was a process for complete streets where we identified a lot of these problems and they were prioritized separately in our complete streets prioritization plan. So it's kind of merging some of those goals into this. That would be a good one for complete streets funding to keep. So once the crosswalks are enhanced with
my crosswalk.
right with complete streets,
That's going to be
then
enhanced.
maybe we turn to focusing on those intersections and really start kind of moving forward.
Jeff, isn't that something that's going to be explored though? As I understand, some new housing slated in that area as well, where the old gas station.
Yeah, that's been approved.
Right. So Jim's package store and the gas station.
Doesn't that trigger some kind of review of what might be going on there?
I don't think they had anything for they just, the gas station's going to be gone and they're putting up a 3-story building.
Right.
Right, so that was approved by the planning board 2017. There's a sidewalk that would be installed and that would continue from Adams and around the front. And then, we're getting into really just really talking about something specific, but their sidewalk plan needs to interact with the potential crosswalk improvement. So people are looking at that. That project, the status of that project is unclear whether they're poised or whether they're ready to actually do it, but it's been approved. I think you had your hand up. Yeah, so let's make sure we get some stuff on the list before we get too tired.
I was thinking one of the things we have on there is the Lower Mill Pond improvement. It talks about having more access for events, things and stuff. And I think it has to do with the mill side of the pond. But maybe we could do something that would focus on making improvements on the other side that's in the Harrison Federal Street area to sort of make that more.
To emphasize on that, you're right.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. The emphasis has been on, since this new development in Ferry Street, is that they're going to increase the parking and the parkway against that. The pond's still dirty. Okay? You can have all you want, but I'm a fisherman, I'm an outdoorsman. The pond's a scum. Okay, I'm sorry to say that. Is there any plans on having the pond dredged and cleaned like they did in Upper Mill? And the other thing I would love to see, and if I won the lottery, I would gladly pay for it. We have the pylons. Why not bring the old bridge back that goes from New City to the factories? That would be really nice.
Even a pedestrian.
Yeah. But again, the pylons are there. Have some lights, solar lights out there. People can walk at night. You can fish off the pier. You can walk from, now with the traffic coming around with the new system there, you can walk from New City across and get a beer in Pleasant Street area and just walk across the pond, bringing that back.
That's a historic, that's also a historic element as well.
Right.
One of the issues on dredging it was, years back, we looked at it, the fear of what you're going to find under there from all of those industrial.
Well, you're right, and that's the thing that's being important, is that you don't want to eat the fish because the fish grows green.
But then again, if you dig, you may not be able to fish there. So that's
Keep in mind too,
the
a
conundrum.
good portion of Lower Mill Pond is privately owned.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
About half of it is owned by the mill.
It's owned by one ferry.
Correct.
Where is
So
New
it's
City?
privately owned.
What's?
New City was one of the
No, New City is Ferry Street on the other side of the pond.
Right. So that I want to.
No.
I wanted to ask you, living in that area, do you dub that New City? So Parsons run through, and the side streets off of Parsons that go towards the pond. Are we calling that New City?
That's correct.
Okay.
That is the old term for it, is New City.
Right.
The problem is with it is that when people come into town that are new, New City is not new, it's old.
Yeah.
Okay, so they get the misconception that it's like, we have sidewalks that have been broken in town for years and years and years and fallen aside to the pond, but yet we get housing developments of, 200 housing units a year in that area.
Well, because that's one of the projects that, we wanted to try to see if it can take shape over the next year or two. So with the surveys that went out to that neighborhood, the timeline that we have for next year's grant, which is, it's March basically, and there's a way that you back out that timeline to basically like 4 weeks from now. We have to have all the information necessary to make the application. It looks like we're not going to have enough information to pursue New City in FY19, which is like a March application. But this exercise is really helpful because if we can position it on this list, then that's a project that we would probably pursue in FY20, for example, once we have enough of the income surveys back in. So the idea is that we would assess those sidewalks, assess the infrastructure, and then come up with a design plan to work on improving it. So that, Jamie, you know the history of this, but like our project on Admiral Street in the neighborhood, sort of where Briggs Street is, that neighborhood was planned in like 2013, 14, yep, and then the construction started in 16, 17, 18, so we're constructing back there. So we do have to have this somewhat longer vision or longer view for certain projects. But so if I, improvements to, so I wanted to add some language like our historic neighborhoods, such as New City, and then there's, on the other side is Pleasant Green, is the other sort of really historic neighborhood that we have that originated with the mills. So I think highlighting those as priority areas in the future is something that's beneficial to do now so that we can start looking at those going ahead. So I'm just going to scratch the notes for historic neighborhoods, including or such as New City. I'll make my
We
note
moved
there.
to New City because we just absolutely love the area, absolutely love it. And believe me, okay, as a owner of rental property there and personal property, it's like if my taxes have to go up because the improvements are being made there, that just means that my value of my property is going up, and I'm willing to take that chance.
Except that's also going to put some seniors out on the street, and the worst thing you can do to a senior is force them to move because they can't pay taxes.
Right, so we
And
have
you're
this-
gonna
right.
increase senior mortality, which is inhumane to me.
So we probably have a discussion of where the senior, the seniors are referenced in the list and see if we want to move that up a little bit. But I want to make sure we have one more kind of sweep to get new ideas. I know we're going to hand up for
Yes,
a while, so thanks.
So the issue that I'm interested in is private owners of historic properties on our main routes. And the one that has me thinking about this is the D&D Auto Supply or Auto Parts store right on the Rotary. I live right behind it and we walk by it every day. And it's a fascinating building. A couple of really nice people own it. It's historic. It was apparently, at least we're told, the original building that was building the carriages in this town. We're also told that there was or is, but blocked off, a tunnel from the basement of that building that goes down to the Manhattan River that was part of the Underground Railroad. Whether that's all true or not, that's what we're hearing. So they are fixing up the building. They, from what I know, they want to keep the building and sell it as is because they really value the historic aspect of the building. But I think that couple is kind of ready to be done with this property. So when you have an historic building like that, or at least one of major consequence that's on a major route, like right on our Rotary, what kind of help is there for a private owner to either help and connect with people who are going to do what we might, as a city, consider the right thing to do with that property? Whether it's, aside from connections, maybe helping a new purchaser to do the right thing with that property. So that's basically the idea, is just to,
I'm not sure the age of the building, but it may very well be historic, but originally on that site was a church. And in fact, if you look in front of where they put the hot dog stand, you'll still see 2 or 3 steps there. That
so it was a
originally
church, not a house.
It was
I'm hearing all
not
different
that
things.
building, not that building. It was a beautiful church,
Okay.
like the congregational
Yeah,
church.
it was the first it was the first church in town, the first congregational
right there.
church.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
We have historic districts listed somewhere in here.
Mhm.
We all read it, but I can't remember because there's too many. There was one that encouraged the city to. So there's a couple different tools that might.
34, I think it's 34. Yeah.
Okay. So we would probably try to maybe elaborate a little bit more on that. Seth?
Yeah, is there something about this research into securing different types of grants through historic preservation, all the different intersections of both state and regional funding for 37 priorities?
So can you rephrase it one more time? So are you
Well,
talking
just in the
specifically
sense
about
that
historic?
there are historic buildings like the schools and whatnot, so there's different ways to leverage different programs to bring in money. Like in the same way that there was only that money from that grant to be able to transfer the schools over to the middle school site, we would have lost that if the vote didn't go through.
Right.
Are there other methods to increase different kinds of funding through different sources to be able to reprioritize based on funding elements?
Right. Jamie, will you give a quick recap of the historic inventory project that we have sort of underway, and then maybe take a shot at like historic tax credits? Because there's a range of things that the city can do. One is we're sort of slowly in the process of inventorying our historic structures, so it's kind of like the baseline. And then a bigger project like One Ferry, although that's probably not the best example, some projects with historic buildings can pursue historic tax credits, but then you get into that realm and it's very complicated. So we're probably somewhere in the middle about leveraging funds or finding other resources.
And there are state grants for cultural facilities. Friends can probably speak to that. She's been intimately involved in spearheading the Old Town Hall improvements. So CPA funds are available for historic preservation locally, and then those cultural facility programs are usually they require a large match, and they're limited in how much they'll actually give you. But there's a lot of I guess that it's tough with historic properties to find public money to do it.
So I work for the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, and we have a historic preservationist on staff who may be doing some work with Easthampton currently, but for that baseline study. But she's very good at that's her expertise. So she's very good at finding those resources and kind of connecting them specifically with historic structures, or both, and using private funding, private developers, and then also the historic tax credits and other funding that's available kind of on the state and federal level. So, and obviously we work with Easthampton, but throughout the valley. So, yeah.
And does that work with, I think someone asked a question, does that work with privately owned businesses? Facilities like the auto parts, and probably including that shop road?
Right, yeah, so it's usually a private, probably always a private entity that would be redeveloping or whatever, you working with that property, for instance, into, you know, whatever they're developing it into. But yeah, it's always a
I think
private
about
developer.
preservation, Shop Row is definitely historic.
Yes, and so like Jeff said, you know, as with all these things, at least for the tax credit piece of this, there's, you know, 30 steps that you have to go through, and so, you know, I think Easthampton's going through the first phase of this, but that is available, and she knows a lot more. You know, I can give my card out, or you can contact her office and speak directly with her. She would be more than happy to discuss it with anybody.
What's her name?
Her name is Shannon Walsh.
Shannon Walsh?
Yeah.
And just to put it into perspective, there's about 8,000 structures in Easthampton. By the definitions of what's historic, it's any building, any structure over 50 years is eligible to be listed or inventoried as a historic structure. So if you do the math on that, you're looking at anything built before 1969, which is like everything.
Yes.
And this is one of the things that the Historic Commission is actually working on, is trying to, we can't inventory of the 8,000 structures. I think it's 5,000 are historic. We have something like 2,500 that have been inventoried in the past, but we don't have the capabilities in-house to do all the rest. So it's picking and choosing what are the structures that are meaningful and relevant to the community, and which are the ones that aren't. A 1950s ranch might be historically significant if it's part of a subdivision that was part of the growth of Easthampton, but if it's just a 1950s ranch house in the middle of a historic, it has less historic value.
So did you mean at all, was there a possibility of projects that are on the list that are eligible for more intersectional funding to be prioritized because they're more likely to be feasible to get done because of their eligibility for intersectional funding?
I mean, maybe that they're prioritized, but also like looking at that different intersectionality funding, as well as potentially what Northampton did with putting a tax which was more volunteer towards Smith to put some money towards the town, which maybe we should do towards who's over here. Perhaps, maybe, because of the property tax situation with the vote that went through, a lot of people voted no because it was going to hurt them to personally in the property tax realm with their lower income and whatnot. So I'm wondering where that money can be made up.
What is intersectional funding, if it can be said briefly?
Sure. I was thinking, and what Seth was saying is there, you'll see things on the list that are potentially eligible for more than one funding stream. So something up here could be eligible for just CDBG grants, but then some could be eligible for, a whole bunch of other government.
Multiple sources.
Multiple acronym sources of funding, yeah. And will those be prioritized because they maybe they're a little bit more realistic to actually get accomplished because they have multiple sources of potential income.
Also wondering, I guess along those lines, if this is, kind of a linear prioritized list, but is it possible and has it been done to look at, items on this list that actually yield or sort of open up space for other items on the list? So like, is there sort of higher order? There are also different levels. So there's like, improve access to the river, but then also kind of developing, economic development strategies are very different orders of magnitude. So and one might yield the other. So I didn't know, has that been done, or is that possible?
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, I think we're in the middle. So I think it's a reminder that this process originates as a step in applying for community development block grant funds. So there's an element of this exercise historically that we've done to make sure we prioritize those block grant projects, but it is part of the broader community strategy. My thought process has been for quite some time is that we're right in the middle of this time frame where we should be talking about an entire master plan for the whole city, and I think that that's where a project like updating the master plan would be more along the lines of taking the order of magnitude of the priorities and really adjusting them across the whole spectrum of issues and items to address in the town. So we're right in the middle of doing a pretty linear list and trying to embark on a larger master plan kind of process where you are really looking at the whole view. So we're right in the middle. So I think it's a good comment. I think for the purposes of getting through tonight, I think we are kind of stuck with just kind of looking at this list, but I think it's part of a bigger project that we're now approaching 11 years since our master plan was kind of adopted, and there was like a 5-year run up to that. So, that's a project that I think you would see in the next couple of years is a full visioning for the entire community. And I think that's when you would get to like really breaking these out, not in a linear way, but in a more comprehensive way.
Was there a specific item that you wanted to see?
It's generally, for me, it's very, that I have difficulty navigating like the order of what to pay attention to because it's of the list format. But I'm also a little confused about, because I missed the beginning, is the objective here to sort of find out which, some of these that we might want to make sure are showing up in the goals and objectives and updating ones appropriately? Like, is that the...
Mayor, do you want to take a stab and then I'll...
Yeah, I mean, so the goals and objectives are sort of broad picture. The specific projects are really what we're trying to figure out most immediately, what we're going to be applying for the FY 2019 block grant program. And so the new items that we're coming up with, fitting them into this list, and then trying to figure out if this order makes sense. And part of the like randomness, seeming randomness that I think you're picking up on is because every time that we've done this, the priorities have shifted a little bit, depending on who's in the room and what the needs of the community are at the time. We've removed items that we finished and that no longer need to be on the list. So that can
So we're on projecting. I just wanted to make sure I was understanding kind of what level you're commenting at. But the one I'm really interested in Baker's civic education. I don't even know, program that they just passed through that is mandating sort of civic education in high school and public schools again, which is really exciting, I think, for Massachusetts. And so I wonder about, I'm just wanting to highlight the youth component. I guess those are either the youth center or sort of youth-related activity, and that might be an area to
It's number 8.
I guess there is a star on that one, or seeing if there's a way to kind of tie that into some of the activities at the state level.
Did you tie that to number 8? Yeah, okay. That's good, very useful. Does anyone else want to, you guys been quiet over there? Anybody?
Is this the only meeting you're having for doing the prioritization of the projects?
Yeah, I mean, I think yes. The answer is yes. Again, to Jamie's point, what we're trying to do is make sure that if we can, we were trying to ensure that we can find a project for the upcoming grant cycle. I think it's clear that there's more to this, but we are constrained with trying to get this meeting accomplished with making sure that we're clear with, especially the block grant. There's projects that we have all talked about that don't qualify for block grant, or that there's no way that we could get enough information for March. But I think that this list is informative for next year's grant too, which will give us a lot more lead time to prepare or gather more information. So I think the idea that maybe you guys were, Jamie gave an overview that we are having a public hearing on the 30th of January, which would be to, if we have a project that we're going to move forward, it would be to determine the project. So that's something that's done in consultation with the mayor's office. And then the public hearing is held on that project to move it forward for the March application. But as I've been learning and working with Ted and James, it's hard to just randomly pick one, because if you're picking the neighborhood of New City, for example, we've started to gather the income information and surveys, but we've gotten very few responses. So it looks like we're not going to have enough responses to justify that project for March, but we would probably continue to pursue that for FY20. Just to be clear, another project that we could more quickly kind of move to the front of the list is continuing the infrastructure project in the Admiral Street neighborhood. So there's a portion of Maple Street that's been already identified as part of that project. If we can't have enough information or find an income eligible neighborhood, we would probably pursue that project just because we have all the information that we need. So that's something that we're waiting for a couple more responses in that neighborhood to determine that if it qualifies, so.
No, we haven't done anything tonight about prioritizing.
Right,
We've
so maybe we
added
should
some.
shift, yeah.
But how do we, what's gonna be the process for prioritizing?
Well, see, I would say if we're done adding, then we can go through what we've added and see where they fit in and to reprioritize.
But are we talking about reprioritizing all 37 plus?
If there's a need, you know, there's a lot of talk tonight about, you know, streets and sidewalks and crosswalks, pedestrian safety, those types of things. So maybe that seems that would be more important than where it's currently listed. We have it, you know, top third, middle third, bottom third, roughly high priority, medium priority, low priority.
Sure. I mean, I don't want to just say shout it out, but I mean, we're kind of close to that. I mean, I think if someone has a really strong opinion about something they've heard, and it's not, you know, necessarily in the right place on the list, let's try it. Let's try that a little bit, see what we can.
One of the first priority up there is strengthening downtown through housing. And the first goal here is housing. I don't have to tell you and Jamie from EDIC meetings, we've been focusing strongly on housing. If there's one way to stabilize values, to stabilize your tax base, it's growth. And we have little to no housing growth in Easthampton, and we have a huge need. You know, there's very few apartments for rent in Easthampton, and there's very few houses for sale in Easthampton. And there's nothing like a lack of supply to drive up cost. And I don't know if there's a way either through zoning, we talked about it before, I'm just beating it to death, Jamie, sorry. If there's a, you know, zoning, working with private landowners, encourage development. You know, one that jumps out at me is if I look up Florence Road, the whole right side of Florence Road, as far as you can see, is housing. The left side is open space. You know, is that begging for housing development? And maybe some of it can be open space protected too, but there's a balance.
Unpopular.
Well, there's a balance between open space and housing. You want lower taxes, stabilized values, stabilized tax base. You can't have it all open space.
Well, and there's also, as Mike has brought up, there's a balance between having, you know, housing that turns over and allowing the seniors the ability to stay in their homes. And there's that balance as well.
And encouraging diversity in the city through actually having affordable housing.
Correct. So there are affordable housing components within any new development. The problem is there's no development happening.
But you can create housing without having to take open space. You can, and JP told us at a council meeting that this is viable. You can allow senior citizens to build modular home for themselves on the back of their property, tax-free, so that they can rent out the front house and live free in their smaller home until they die, at which point it goes back on the tax rolls.
Right. So I think
there are ways to do it. You don't have to take open space to create housing.
Well, I think we go a little higher level than that specific of a discussion, but I think we have the goal, but we don't really have a priority project. So if there's something along the lines of trying to stabilize housing values through growth of new units, and it's really all types of housing. I mean, that's, to me, trying to extrapolate that, there's a priority project that's not even really listed, which is to kind of, you know, really pursue a bunch of different ways to increase the number of housing units we have. I think we want to keep it kind of general. So, okay, so there's a hand over there.
I just want to know, there's so many blocks that have beautiful, charming old homes that some have been poorly updated over the years, but could be restored. But when people are putting up affordable housing, aren't there restrictions? You go down these blocks and eyesores have been put up, brand new buildings from the 60s or 70s or 80s. They were just slept in there and just ruined the whole block. Is there any way that people are being watched over in terms of what they're putting up and
design guidelines?
Generally aesthetically guided.
Yeah. I mean, design guidelines can be sort of a new, I don't know that there's, so yeah, design guidelines for new development. It's a,
It kind of brings down a whole community when you start putting crap up
Well, I
in
think,
the middle of them.
I think crap goes up regardless of whether or not it's affordable or market rate. You know, market rate developers take shortcuts, affordable housing developers put together beautiful units. It's not just, I don't want to have a conversation that disparages affordable housing. There's a lot of regulations that, if you're doing a mixed rate development in Easthampton, our zoning requires you to make the units the same level, regardless of who's gonna live in that unit. There are other, funding sources that require similar types of,
Is it worth taking a straw vote and just say how many people think that housing is one of the most important, if not the most important thing, and just go through these so that we can prioritize?
Sure.
so let's talk about housing. So in
Yeah.
terms of the group here, I mean, prioritizing housing in general, new housing unit development is critical, but do we want to move it up on the list? This is, Jamie and I talked about this part of the process.
So number 1, 2, 3, 5, and then I think it's down to like 30 are all about housing. So,
So the top 3 are already out.
I don't
we
disagree
do
with
it's
that.
housing rehab, new units, in vacant buildings, mixed use.
So the only thing about, so I'll just jump in myself. Number 1 is really seeming to focus on downtown, and so it seems like to me again there's a priority project that is more generalized about stabilizing housing values or adding new units in general. So I think that to me there's kind of a generalized housing project that's not real. We should be pursuing multiple methods to increase the number of housing units we have. So
Yeah,
we
Jeff,
don't want to dictate exactly what we're going to do.
There
but
was a
just
method
the
to
goal.
that madness there, Jeff, excuse me, to kind of focus in and mention downtown, was to keep to keep the density proportionate to the downtown area and not encourage sprawl out into the open space areas and everything else. So that's why downtown was specifically mentioned, to keep that focus.
Fair,
And
fair, yeah.
I know this will get into zoning, but, I mean, one way to help with the density would be to allow the buildings to go up rather than out, if we could go. Yes.
And infill development is also another strategy that.
Right.
Yeah, so, I mean, this list is a little overwhelming, it's hard to like, fill out anything in particular, but one thing I would say is that some of these look like they're mostly maintenance, and it seems to pay for maintenance with grant money seems like an unsustainable way of doing business. So I would tend to think that we should not prioritize those.
Do you have a specific?
What is
There's
the
specific
maintenance, what do
item?
you think is the maintenance goal?
I don't know, there's something about, like, say, rebuilding of sidewalks or something. Yeah, so not that I don't think sidewalks are important, but you know, if we're using grant money, the money comes once, and so it should be something that's permanent. And certainly housing is something that's fairly permanent, and it's also something that's not a maintenance liability for the town. So, right, in addition to the other reasons, right?
Did you have something to say about, did you say capital improvements? Did you mutter that? No?
Oh, just moderate, yeah. The capital, I mean, that's sidewalking as a capital project, not a maintenance project, just as it's summarized here, but
I don't know. Because there is a whole aspect of capital improvements, which is where the city spends their tax revenue dollars on infrastructure and other things. So it's definitely an element. But, and I guess I'm going to hazard a guess here, but to Eli, to your point is, the grant funds are generally geared to that methodology where there's usually not enough grant money to build a whole bunch of new housing. It's something that we have organizations that, you know, do develop new housing and they seek other tax revenues to assist in paying for it. So it's hard to just say that grant funds would just build new housing, because I think it's just not geared that way. There's not enough dollars to generate housing units. So maintaining existing housing stock has always been something that older communities, you know, that's a clear focus. And you know, agencies like Department of Housing and Urban Development, that's one of the things that they focus on, is taking your existing housing stock and making sure that you're continuing to do maintenance and upgrades so that you still have the housing stock. So I understand why you pointed it out. I think for the grant sources that we are kind of looking at, it's hard to use those to just generate new housing.
No, I understand, but I mean, you know, none of them are actually use the money correctly to build housing, right? There are ones that are, you know, there are ones that are directed toward encouraging housing to be built, right?
I feel like in terms of investing in the community and stuff that will pay off eventually, there's a few items up there that could be kind of grouped together in terms of financing for small business and micro enterprise, which also ties into education and financial literacy and foreclosure prevention, because if houses go into foreclosure, they actually sell at lower prices, which means that it drops property value in the neighborhood, which decreases the tax base. And also on the same hand, encouraging first-time homebuyer education and support for people that don't normally have the ability to buy in their community. Is part and parcel of investing in the community, maintaining community diversity, and keeping homes occupied in the town, and keeping homes from going into foreclosure. As part of financial literacy on a larger and long-term scale. You know, to keep people from losing their homes and get them into homes and get people, a diverse population of people, into businesses in town, so that those businesses then add to the community. I feel like all of those things tie together and should be a priority. And that would be something, those would all be things that would feed into the community and then get back to the community and to the tax base.
I was just going to say, for the CDBG, but you say housing as sort of a general thing, is you have to have specific project to go into CDBG, like housing rehab, where there's something specific, and that's, so if you don't have a housing project, you can't apply for funding other than maybe a planning grant if you had something, we're going to explore housing in this part of town or something to see if we're going to find a location, right?
Yeah, but they specific with CDBG funding, they don't like to fund creation of new units. There's some, I can speak to this better than I can, but it's related to whether or not it's in a new building versus rehab in an existing building.
Yeah.
And so
The acquisition.
Yeah, so rehab, making new units in an existing building, they sometimes fund, but new units from scratch they won't fund. The housing rehab has a lot of bang for the buck, because in order to qualify for the housing rehab loan, you need to demonstrate that you are someone who's low or moderate income. And typically, people who are homeowners who are low and moderate income don't have a lot of extra cash to do the necessary code improvements or public safety, the safety improvements that they would need to do in their housing. And these tend to snowball if they're not taken care of. So by maintaining those housing units or keeping them bringing them up to code, it does actually benefit the entire community.
So would that go to what Mike was saying about with having the houses, with having the I guess it'd be in-laws need to be adding extra house to live in?
Sure. I mean, I live in a house, I've got 4 bedrooms, it's too big for my wife and I. If we built a small modular house out in the back where we could live, get us, maybe there's a separate mortgage program for these types of things, then we could live back there, rent out the front of the house. Now you've created room for 4 more people
Who would
in
want to live in
town.
front of you, Mike?
You wouldn't, I know that.
You in the backyard. I'm just thinking of, I'm looking at that first-time home buyer who's thinking of buying a house and they've got a modular unit in the backyard. It might work, as you said, in-laws, it might work for relations where, a son or a daughter's looking for their first home, maybe that kind of concept works. But if I'm 25 years old and I'm buying my first house, I'm not sure I want a modular home in my backyard.
Well,
Especially with you.
if it's done right, and it reduces your mortgage because you're renting that out now after the old people die, now you can have a home for much less money.
I guess.
No, I think
Not everybody
I've
is
been
rich.
raising my
Yeah,
hand.
okay, yeah, and then I don't see that too, so.
With all the thoughts of new housing and everything, please consider traffic. The increase of traffic. We want more people in town for businesses and housing. We're gonna have a lot more traffic. The traffic in town now is horrendous, so just get that in there somewhere.
Okay, and then see that you wanted
I
to.
just wanted to see if I could make a process improvement or request for a process intervention, if that's possible.
For you, I think we should allow that.
I'm just, because given the timing and how complicated this is to do with a large group of people, I wonder if we could just do that in groups of 4 and just go through the list in groups of 4 and make some, if we have some recommendations to do that. That might accelerate and also make sure that everyone gets actually to have a say, because there are a lot of people who haven't said much, so. I don't know if that's.
But I had another thought on that. I mean, our goal tonight seems to really be to prioritize things that would qualify for CDBG grants. So can we eliminate the ones that don't? And it seems like you've already identified which do and don't qualify for CDBG grants up there. And then you could at least get a sense of the priority of this group of people, which is just our own. If everybody just listed whatever you want, their top 5 out of the ones eligible for CDBG, or the top whatever. But we need some, like you said, we do need some. The processor will be here the rest of the night.
Just want to go home?
My eyes are starting to glaze over. I don't know if it's happening to anybody else, but it's so complex. And frankly, I don't know how many of us have actually studied and memorized parts of this to even to have the connection to, that's the one that goes with CDBG and all that. It's very complex.
Can I just jump in? I think the important part, the biggest or the most important part is for a large group like this. I mean, we can divide it into groups and go through the individual ones, but the goals and objectives are more of, I think you can, it's a smaller list that will show us when we're looking back at the notes from tonight. If everyone looks at that list and says, okay, the first one is we're talking about housing, okay, great. Discuss that, and everyone seems to be on board with that being one. And then we can kind of fit in, I mean, all of these have something to do with our goals here at some level. So really, I mean, really we're talking about the goals and objectives, about what people want to prioritize.
So if you reorder that the way that you like,
yeah,
that
and all
will influence this crazy spreadsheet you're going to develop based on more people's input.
So we only need to prioritize the 6 goals and objectives.
But the city officials can.
I'm fine with that. I'm interested in what CDI proposed. It's just whether we can do that with the time remaining. I'm not sure. I think, to me, observing it so far, if you look at the goals and objectives, the thing that's missing is the element of pedestrian safety and perhaps traffic overall. I mean, I think if you look at those goals, it's fairly comprehensive and it does relate to a lot of the things that we've discussed. But I don't see pedestrian safety anywhere there, and to me that's pretty high on the priority, but it does dovetail with a couple of the new items that we would add to the list. So that would be something that I would sort of propose that we add pedestrian safety it's mainly sort of that area around downtown. So, I mean, pedestrian safety everywhere is important, but we do need to kind of condense it a little bit. So it'd be Cottage, Union, Main Street, and Pleasant Street. That's sort of that long loop. I mean, we did talk about Northampton Street. So pedestrian safety is a generalized thing that, you know, I would propose to the group that we add it to the goals and objectives to make sure that that's an overarching goal that we would then have priority projects underneath that.
Would pedestrian safety fall under walkability in general? Because
Yeah, I think-
walkability is a really bigger
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah, I think we had pedestrian safety, walkability, ease of access, you know, all the things that come with pedestrian safety are part of that.
So let's make it number 7 and then prioritize those 7 goals.
Yeah, so I'll work on that. Jamie, do you want to grab some other comments here? So.
Hi, I'm wondering if we can move number 31 up, which is accessibility to the library. I think the library is very important that the library is accessible to all citizens. I don't know how long it hasn't been.
Is there consensus to move?
Please move the library.
That's, yes.
That's next week.
So let's just focusing on 31, which is the accessibility to library and improvements to library. So that's we want to see what that like.
Yeah, I mean,
No,
I think for moving, I think this is where I'm circling this process, that there's no criteria for that shift, which I think we probably all agree that, but I know we get to this.
And you know what, if we had 20 other people here that were not us, we'd all say something different.
Yeah, is that even city-owned?
Yeah.
No.
The library's not even
No,
city.
the library is not city-owned. As I'm surprised that they weren't forced to make it handicapped compliant when they did the last work on it, because I run the Parsons Closet, and I had somebody from the state out looking at that building, and he was explaining about thresholds and so forth. And what he told me is that if in the course of 3 years doing work on the building, we went over a 30% threshold of 30% of the property value, then we would have to make the building fully handicap compliant. Now, I don't know what the worth of the library is, but given all the work they just did, I wouldn't be surprised if it did go to at least 30% of the value of the building. So how do they get away with not having made the basement the kids' room accessible?
That's a really good question and well outside of the scope of.
So I want to jump back to this real quick, because I have a feeling we're not going to be able to incorporate this magnificent idea. If we had done it at 6, maybe we could have. But so we have housing. That's goal number 1. Goal number 2 is enhance the local climate for sustainable economic development in the commercial downtown industrial area. Pedestrian safety is added to this list. So we want to look at, I think Ted's idea is good for the time being, because I think the reality of our project scope for this March application is going to be fairly limited. And I think we would like to make this process more robust for an FY20 application. I think, but for this purpose, I think if we could look at these goals for a few more minutes and then use this as the basis to look at projects, I think that's going to be how we may need to conclude tonight. But so there's open space priorities, public services and technology resources. So the public services is a large group of things that we talked about before: the social services, the first-time home buyer. Of course, is probably the housing rehabilitation program could fall under there, or actually the housing one. Then we have the protecting key historic and cultural resources. So we have Old Town Hall listed, the library, Maple Street School Center, and that would include other historic resources that we have. And then number 6, Jamie and I were talking about number 6, and we were looking back. So Jamie did this meeting last year. This is my first time doing this meeting, but number 6 was unclear as to the intent. But we were thinking that, and I don't know if you wordsmithed it at all, but if you want to take a shot at kind of looking at number 6 and how we talked about it.
Yeah, so I think rewarding number 6, something along the lines of make planning, growth, and activity decisions so as to create connections based on the needs of people and the relationship to infrastructure, resources, and services. Seems to make more sense to me than what was originally written, but as far as I can tell, it's always been the number 6 priority going back to about 2000, and it's been in that same wording.
Can you read again what you
Make planning, growth, and activity decisions so as to create connections based on the needs of people and the relationship to infrastructure, resources, and services.
It sounds like it makes a little more sense.
Right. And I would,
better, but I don't still understand what, all right.
yeah, I would dub it as a catch-all. It's sort of a catch-all, making connections. So our decisions should be based on the needs of the community. I mean, that's one way. I mean, that's the gist of it. But so based on this, I mean, we added pedestrian safety, so there would be some additional wording attached to pedestrian safety, the connectivity, access. So this one definitely does not belong as number 7. It would move up, and I'll just make a plea to kind of jumpstart this. The open space and recreation priorities, the Manhan River Greenway, land for agriculture use, recreation improvements. There is some, importance of focusing on existing parks. There are opportunities that certain parks in certain neighborhoods could be funded by block grant, but at the time being, knowing what I know and what we looked at, there are not a lot of opportunities right now for block grant to fund that, unless we get a little bit more specific. Our downtown visioning work may guide us more to a specific project that would move up next year. So I propose, from hearing what I've heard, this pedestrian safety goes somewhere between or before or after number 2. And I think
That's
that
a good number 3.
Right. I think we've had consensus on pedestrian safety as being critical. And again, as Ted described, we look for the goals to be clear so that we go through the priority list and we can pick something that fits there, and we know that there's some consensus on the goal as being important. So, sir, yes.
What about project number 24? Continue to work on it to increase access to use and improving like pedestrian ways, public transit, including expanding coverage of PDPA.
Right.
But that's not a CBDG. Yeah. It's not coded as a CBDG grant opportunity.
Jeff, did you say, I'm sorry, just go back for a second. Did you say that there were projects related to the goals that could be in the March project, March plan?
Right. So the two projects that might fall into that opportunity that we've seen so far is, we had potentially ambitious goals of looking at new cities. So so the block grant funds allow you to do planning and design work. So the initial thought was to look at the neighborhood. So that neighborhood is one of our most historic. So the planning would allow you to look at sidewalks and underground infrastructure and evaluate them. Do they need to be updated? Are they old? Do they need to be repaired? And then design, the concept was to look at potential redesign of the intersection of Parson and Ferry. So there's a huge blind spot on that corner. So the idea of design would be to begin design work so that in a couple years down the road, when Ferry Street is redeveloped, then we have a design plan in place to look for funding to build. So, but we don't know that we're going to have the income surveys back in time for that to be an eligible project. So the other one was Maple Street. So our existing project, I wish we had a map. Our existing project in Admiral Street has a series of 4 or 5 streets that have been reconstructed over the past couple of years. Right. Maple and Charles are on that list. So based on the income surveys, that would be one that we could potentially continue to pursue.
Another reason I raised that is regardless of our goals and priorities, shouldn't we be working on whatever it is you think you can incorporate into the March proposal? Because otherwise it's going to be 2020.
Right.
It seems to me that the communication with the neighborhood, with the new city neighborhood people, just get them to get the surveys in.
Is it door knocking?
Yeah, I mean, it's just like flyer it or door knocking, whatever, you know, just.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem with New City myself, and again, being there for a number of years, is that, and I'll speak for neighbors that I know personally throughout the area, we just feel that we've been neglected so long that we don't come to these meetings because our voice will not be heard. I really feel that.
But they've been receiving surveys and not sending them in, apparently.
Right, because they feel because the surveys aren't gonna do them any good because nothing's been happening.
Right, and there's a clearly,
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
well, clearly there's a need to do more outreach and more directly with that neighborhood. So that's something that I think is just more clear, that we need more time to build that relationship with that neighborhood and get the information as to why would you fill out that survey, so what's the value of it. So we need to hold this meeting regardless, so we want to do that. I think some of the input we heard was really valuable in terms of the process. To your point, Tom, I think it's a good question. I don't know, I kind of looked at Ted a little bit, because Ted and PVPC is assisting us potentially with that application. Whether you think there's more value than not to talk specifically about those two projects in more detail for a few more minutes at least.
I mean, we can. This is an important piece or a necessary piece specifically for CDBG, as we've mentioned before. But part of the process also, and what we've been talking about, is stuff that is on this list, is in the goals and objectives that outside of CDBG, the city is going to keep working on. So the two projects, so kind of like big picture, that's what we kind of, even though it doesn't look like big picture, there's 37 of them, but that's kind of the big picture. And then more specifically for just this year's CDBG grant application, the two projects that we are potentially looking at, although, you know, there's always a potential last minute if something pops up in this kind of discussion that we could feasibly do. And I don't know, we'll have to go back and see, look at the notes and see what comes up. But the ones that we've been talking about a little bit here and that were in the works because of the work we've already done at the Adams Street neighborhood to finish that up. I will also say that this, so someone had asked about you asked about the amounts that's earlier on. And so every year it's different, depends on how much you applied to or received the year before. I'd said 800,000 was the max. And this year it's 552,000 because that's the whatever 1.3 minus whatever we got this year. So so that's what, so we're also working, not only we're working in the confines of what's eligible, what we have information for, but also we have, you know, a limited.
Yeah, I guess the only reason I raised it is I understand our 7 goals or 7 priorities,
Yeah.
That's great. But we might have to go to the table in March with what's shovel ready.
Yes, yes.
Even though it might be priority number 3.
That's correct, yep.
Rather than leave the $500,000.
Yes,
on the table.
yes, agreed.
Well, maybe it's not a bad idea to begin to think about 22,
Yeah.
20 as well.
Right.
And, you know, have a meeting down at New City.
Right.
Planning department go down there.
Right, so to that point, so for the new city section, I mean, this, if that is not what we pursue this round, that we're gonna keep, you'll probably see us out there in the next few months.
I'll tell you right now, if you want me to be a guy that knocks on doors, I'll knock on every door there is in
I
New
guess,
City.
I guess the problem with New City, and I don't mean to say the problem with New City, I own property there.
Yeah, I know.
The problem is that it's 90% non-owner occupied.
Right.
So you're getting tenants who say,
Sure.
Right.
I'm just paying rent and living here, I don't care what you do to the streets and sidewalks. I go to work every day, I come home at night, I love my little yard, it's my own little world, but, you know, Wayne's in a minority as an owner occupied in New City.
And my problem in New City is, or not New City, but overall, is that I want to keep my property at a lower level where I can have affordable housing. Okay, but the problem is, how do I get money to do capital improvements on my house and not raise my mortgage, where I have to raise the rent to keep it above that status? I don't have that information.
Well, and one of the things that CBD grants can do is also things that you as a homeowner can't, you know, or a renter can't handle. You know, it's like if the sewage pipes go because they're old and fall apart, I don't, if you can be happy in your job and be going back and forth and not be, invested as a renter, but you suddenly care about what grant, is available if things don't flow.
Well, I think this is actually one of the best discussions we had all night, which I think is really just sort of alerting us to the fact that we probably need to prioritize our process and retool the process. So, Jamie took this on last year. We've had a significant change in the planning department. So we're attempting to do this because we need to hold the public meeting. But I think what I heard of value is potentially retooling our process to look at FY20. One of the things that I started to look at, so I think to Tom's point, with the idea of going back to the neighborhood that we already have work going on, is there's an opportunity if we get enough of the survey responses back for continuing Maple Street. It's a big lift. We'd have to try really hard to package everything up to allocate the $550 to continue to work on Maple Street, so that we could free up that $550,000 in FY20 to do something different that is more sort of an organic, agreed upon process. So just in a quick summary, the section of Maple Street is generally from this intersection, or it's one of these crossroads that runs from Maple.
North Hampshire, I believe.
North Hampshire is.
Your fingers on it.
Yeah, so the section that we would, in theory, be talking about maybe at the public hearing in January 30th is trying to pursue the continued construction from here to the end of Charles, because with 550, there's generally, I'm going to really generalize this, but there's about $100,000 of that, which is admin, oversight, design, and overseeing the construction project. So it leaves you with, for example, $400,000 to continue this work.
Does that include the sewer pipe that runs underneath 171 Maple Street? Because there's a...
Just let me finish my thought real quick. So, but then, if we were able to prioritize this project for FY19, then in theory we could come forward with a more robust process to look at FY20, and we would have the almost the full $800,000 or some part of it, because I guess Charles is still on the list. So, by maybe doing, or we're looking at Maple Street, we free up the money to do a different style project in FY20. So
I like to sometimes look at CDBG as it's not extra money, but if we focus on, as an example, Maple Street, and the town then doesn't have to use their current resources to do that particular project, or whatever, pick whatever project you want that we end up doing. But then they can look, and so the point of this process as well, they can look, you guys can look back at this list and say, oh, this is also a priority, let's focus on our town resources. We don't have to focus on Maple Street, for example.
And just real quick, in that neighborhood, Maple, Franklin, which was all torn up last year for gas work and some water line work or whatever, none of that's been repaved. I thought that was in the plan. I mean, none of it's been repaved.
So
It's all chopped up everywhere.
The FY14 grant did a design for Church Street, Brick Street, Admiral Street, Maple Street, North Hampshire, Olympia, and Charles Street, and Clark Street. The FY16 grant did work on Church, part of Admiral, and Briggs, and George. The current grant that we have funding for, the project will start, construction will start in the spring, is North Hampshire Street, Olympia Street, southern portion, Admiral Street, and Clark Street. And then the final section, as Jeff was talking about, was Maple Street and Charles Street, which concludes the design work that we got funded for in FY40.
But that's all underground.
And so, but in order to do all the underground utilities, then you have to repair all the street surfaces, and the sidewalks are then redone after the underground utilities
So
are
is that
put in
slated
place.
to be done in those areas that are already done?
Those neighborhoods, that first section is done. The second section hasn't started yet.
Right, okay.
And the third section we may be applying for. So.
And the only thought I would have about New City is if in 2020 you take a look at New City, someone mentioned knocking on doors. It might be more effective to try to contact homeowners ownership rather than knocking on doors and talking to tenants?
Right, I think it's a mix, I would say, because you need the actual tenant incomes for that. It's not the property
Yeah, I
owner.
can tell you mine are low and moderate incomes.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
They have to build.
to your point, yes, we can work
But
with.
but the
yes.
owners might be able to
Right.
incentivize the tenants to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, don't spread the word, but I'm getting $650 a month for a 3-bedroom apartment in the city.
That's where I am, and the reason I keep it that way is that they don't knock my door when they're missing a key.
They never move.
They never, exactly. I have tenants for 25 years. I've had other apartments where I've charged $1,300 market value, and every 3 months they move out, or every year they move out, or somebody sues me and I gotta pay $3,000 to have them moved. I'd rather keep it where it is right now.
I've been here 25 years, she's not going anywhere. She
Yeah.
treats it like her home.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm genuine when I say that this discussion is really useful because I think it's clear that the process to prioritize this list needs more thought, more time. I mean, I think it's useful that we've added a goal because I think it clarifies where a lot of these projects fall is under the umbrella of public safety or pedestrian safety. I think unless there's some other project that hasn't been listed, I think we have enough for this evening to work with PVPC on trying to prepare for January 30th. I mean, I just want to be clear that if we don't get enough of the responses for Maple Street, which there are not as many, so we sent letters to over 150 property owners in New City. So that was very ambitious to think of
Residents.
right, sorry, to get 50% of those responses back. But I think with Maple, we were looking at a much smaller number to confirm that it's still income eligible. So we talked about on Monday knowing whether we had enough of those responses to propose that project at public hearing January 30th. So again, I think the strategy is if we can pursue constructing that portion of Maple Street with FY19, it'll free up us to propose a different type of project than FY20.
Sounds like a plan.
Have more meetings.
And have more meetings. Yeah. I think that's acknowledged.
Yeah.
We're doing good.
Okay.
So yeah, no, I appreciate everyone coming,
Thank you, everyone.
sitting through our 2-hour meeting.
If you didn't sign in, please sign in. They're not gonna